Yes, we are online. Yeah. We can start now. Hello everyone, and now I would like to ask Professor Winter to begin today's program. And over to you, Professor Winter. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sumava. Very pleased and honored to have my friend Peter Balakian with us today. Peter is speaking from Maine. I am speaking from the French countryside, and we are engaging with the Council for Global Cooperation in Kolkata. This is, I think, a definition of the global conversation that we need to have in order to do justice to the issues of contemporary history that we've been talking about over the last year or two now. And unfortunately, there's little sign in sight that the evisceration of civil society in the Ukraine is going to come to an end. So the issue of the transformation of warfare into an assault on civilian life brings us back to the beginning of the 20th century, inevitably so, and as such to the Armenian Genocide of 1915 and after. And what I'd like to do today is simply introduce Peter Balakian as one of the foremost poets and writers who has explored the landscape of the survivors of the Armenian Genocide, not primarily, but initially, I think, in poetry, and then in prose of an enduring character. The Black Dog of Fate is a classic. It is one of the most extraordinary examples of what Mariana Hirsch calls post-memory, the transition and translation of traumatic memory between generations. I am also well aware, and indeed want to benefit from Peter Balakian's presence to talk about the literariness of historical consciousness, the literariness of the memory boom, which seems to me to be one of its features that has drawn insufficient attention. Writers, in my view, are the inventors of a form of memoir which is inseparable from historical documentation. And indeed, those who are fortunate enough to read the Black Dog of Fate will find chapters of historical inquiry that are part and parcel of the overall presentation of the story that Peter Balakian tells of his family. Now, in this regard, I think the place that we could start is to talk about the genesis of the Black Dog of Fate, Peter, and how you and when perhaps you decided to write it in that form. Right. It is an extraordinary piece of writing, and it has a life story itself, perhaps separate, perhaps coterminous with poetry. Did the prose come out of the poetry? Did the poetry come out of the prose? Are they in some ways inseparable in your mind? Where did the Black Dog of Fate, where was the Black Dog of Fate born?
Well, thank you, Jay. And first, just to say thanks for having me with you, and Sumava to be in Calcutta as well, in some sense, by Zoom, because I have a family tie to Calcutta, in that my great-uncle, great-great-uncle, Garabed Balakian, left London after World War I for Calcutta, where he had vineyards for a while in the 1920s, and there's an Armenian church in Calcutta. So I hope to get there. Right now, this is the closest I've come. And Jay, it's great to be with you. You know, I just so am indebted to your work as a scholar and as a voice and as a public intellectual on many things, but World War I is, of course, your deepest ground. And it's been also great to have worked with you over many years on this terrain. So to come back to your question, you know, I think for me, and I won't speak for all memoirists, of course, because I think there are many spokes on the memoir wheel. But for me as a poet writing memoir emerged out of poetry for me. It emerged out of lyric language. And my particular mode of storytelling is grounded in a number of the, you know, fundamental notions of the lyric poem and the pulsations of lyric language. So much of it emerged from the image and freezing scenes and time with images, the way poets do in their poems, carrying that linguistic and mental process into the memoir is also challenging because you can't write lyric poems and write a memoir. You have to figure out, of course, how to create a new form of language that is also linear, that accompanies plot and narrative and character development. But the image has been really key to the way that for me to the way that memoir evolved and worked. And because my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Nafina Arusian, in her last marriage name in the USA, her first husband, Hagop Chilingurian, was killed on the death march that they were all put on by the Turkish government in August of 1915. She arrived in the U.S. by 1920. And anyway, just to say that Nafina, my maternal grandmother, is such a ground zero force in Black Dog of Fate. And she died when I was 13, and my experience with her was deep and close and profound, as I would come to understand more and more as life evolved for me as a writer and as a person. But getting back to life with my grandmother, to scenes in which I could feel her presence, the presence of her survivor story, her Armenian Genocide survivor story, involved a lot of deep image making, scenes and deep image making. And, you know, there are other kinds of, you read in memoir, there are many other sensibilities and linguistic constructions to memoir. Many of them proceed more out of journalistic rhythms of writing. But the poet's rhythm of prose writing, at least mine, was going to be a little more slow time, a little more deep, you know, immersion in scenes of the past that I was hoping to open up and decode what were, for me as a boy, encoded images of trauma. Because nobody in my family talked openly about the horrors of 1915 and the trauma and bloodshed that my grandparents' generation endured. That you know, my parents didn't want us to know about that. We were the new generation of post-war baby boomers coming of age in the white, privileged, affluent suburbs. I grew up in Tenafly, New Jersey, just over the GW Bridge, in a leafy, beautiful, you know, community. And the past was really kind of kept from us. So, but you know, I came to realize in the writing of Black Dog of Fate that as hard as people try to repress traumatic pasts, they can't fully do it. And so the past leaked through. I like to say it leaked through the sunny suburban, world of Tenafly, New Jersey in the late 50s, early 60s, mid 60s, 1960s mostly. And I was trying to capture the leakage, the encoded traumatic messages that were coming to me, like I would say, like messages in a bottle, like puzzles strewn at my feet. And that became a challenge for me as a writer. The challenge, of course, was how can a writer make the decoding of traumatic messages from his grandmother, in this case, and an interesting story. So for me, poetry is at the core of the memoir.
Well, the question I'd like to put to you from that is, there is your decoding of traumatic memory is different from what Mariana Hirsch talks about as post-memory, in that Mariana Hirsch deals with what I would call conjoint generations. It's how children of survivors seem to feel the same memories as their parents, even though they couldn't have had the same memories as their parents. But you tell a story of fractured generational memory, in which there is a third generation, namely your own, which are the storytellers. And I wonder whether you might comment on a conflict between generations of memory, yours linked to your grandmother's over the head of the difficult generation in the middle of your parents, and maybe other members of your family as well. It's the indirection of your reconstruction of traumatic memory is the heart of my question, and whether you felt that it made it more difficult to tell the story because you aren't the post-memory generation, you were the post-memory plus one generation. Did that affect the way you wrote it?
Well, Jay, yeah, your point is an important one, and it is a distinction between the child growing up in the survivor house who is almost blanketed by a certain kind of darkness, and the grandson, the third generation, who's growing up in a house that is repressing the past consciously and unconsciously. I want to say that my parents were both very proud of their Armenian roots and heritage, but that manifested itself in more quotidian ways, cuisine, dining rituals, church on Sunday, Armenian Apostolic Church, Orthodox Armenian Christianity is very elaborate, Sunday services and all this stuff. But it didn't involve the haunted house of the past. And while that demanded more bridge building for me, and I had one particular aunt, my dear and great aunt Gladys, whose Armenian name was Zivart, and she was my grandmother's oldest child, and she remembered the Death March experience and the refugee experience in the famine-ravaged and disease-ridden refugee quarter of Aleppo. She remembered that. So I did have a really accurate, deep conduit with Auntie Gladys, which came my way when I was in my 20s and beginning to really start digging into the past as a poet at this point, not as a prose writer. But I will say the other impact of the third generation story, the third generation receiver, is there's more freedom. There's more freedom to explore, and there's less kind of oppressive guilt surrounding you. And with the freedom to explore, of course, you can't make things up, but you do have access to other narrative approaches to the past, so that I tracked my own intellectual journey into the Armenian past, because I only had the biggest bridge I had was Auntie Gladys, my one aunt, into her and her mother's trauma death march story. And even that was, not extensive, but it was very concrete and vivid. And so I got to track my own digging into the past, and that meant, trying to bring the reader into what was happening to me as I read, for example, Ambassador Henry Morgenthau's chapters on the Armenian massacres and deportations in his famous memoir of 1918, Ambassador Morgenthau's Story. So those became different, so it became a more complicated weave, if you will, perhaps, then I will think immediately of Art Spiegelman's story, in which he's totally enwrapped in his mother and father's stories. I have some more pathways to tread. And so that affected the structure and the nature of my memoir. Perhaps had more layers, perhaps more moving parts, if you will.
Well, I think this is something of much of great importance in many different memoirs in recent years, which is the breaking of taboos about rape and sexual violence. It seems to me that there's one dimension of the story of the Armenian genocide, which of course is part of all genocides that I know anything about, which is once as it were, the freedom to destroy is absolute, then women are always destroyed in sexual violence. It certainly was true in the Second World War, and unfortunately, there seems to be a good deal of evidence of it happening in Ukraine today. It's not accidental; it's built in. And your handling of the issue of the sexual violence of your grandmother inflicted on her is very delicate, and I think very moving the way you do it. Did you feel any reticence or hesitancy about exploring this deeply personal part of completely true part of the story of the genocide?
Well, I felt being more, again, here I am inventing her consciousness, and the reader knows that. So I'm not, it's not as if she's telling me this. It's that I've learned a few pieces of this from my aunt. I've learned some general pieces to this story that I am inhabiting with a sense of some psychological, or I should say some freedom to imagine. And and this happens a few times in the memoir, where I'm letting you know, like this is true with a portrait of my grandfather from the Balakian side of the family, who is conscripted into the Ottoman army because he's a physician and they needed doctors, and every physician becomes automatically a captain. And he's on an army base on the western coast in Soma, right on the water, right on the Aegean, Mediterranean, I guess. And I know facts, and so from those facts, I'm going to invent a portrait of him. So it's that, and as long as you let the reader know, you as the writer are constructing an imagined portrait based on known realities, then I think it's all square with the reader, and you've been given a little more latitude as a writer because of the more open fields of being a third generation receiver of small amounts of empirical fact and knowledge that you have to figure out how to work as a storyteller.
No, I'm glad you raised it that way, because it seemed to me that the subtlety and indirection of your prose in The Black Dog of Fate was because you had space to suggest, to hint, to move in, shall we say, more than one direction. Poetry, on the other hand, is so compressed that it's almost impossible to do that. Or perhaps you would have another view of that, Peter. My sense is that if there was, maybe Michelle Toussaint will speak to this afterwards if she'd like to, there is something specific about the sexual crimes embedded in genocide, and in this particular genocide, that I think has to be given central prominence. It has to be there, essentially. But in your poetic work, have you addressed the sexual violence of the Armenian genocide?
Again, more
Elusively?
more evocatively, not graphically. These are some early poems of mine in a 1983 book called Sad Days of Light. And in those poems, there are a few poems in which I try to get back to your earlier reflection on the place of poetic imagination in historical memory. I was following out those threads and those scents of the past through poetic images and the strange pulsations of phrases and lines as poets that you as a poet you make to construct the compressed lyric form. And but I didn't but I was going to say I would be very hesitant in the lyric form of being overly what I want to say, melodramatic or graphically graphically I would say inappropriate, but graphically inappropriate is the best word I can come up with right now. You want to be very careful that you don't overstep a line that would maybe violate a deeper truth. So I can only say generally that there are a few poems in which I evocatively drifted into that region in earlier poems, but I've never tried to. I think in prose I felt more solidity and narrative foundation in the writing to be able to build a character's mind. Harder to do in the poem.
The point, I think the only line of thinking that I was going to ask you to reflect on is this: that the act of not only individual but mass sexual violence is an attempt to destroy the Armenian family, not just the Armenian nation, but the bedrock of the nation, the family. That is what happened in Rwanda as well. There is something deeply destructive about it, and yet the story of your family is of immense strength. The Black Dog of Fate is a story of a family where the electric sparks between you and your aunts are the stuff of a very powerful family. And one of the feelings that I had was that the way in which your conflicts with your father were played out, the way in which that extraordinary moment of poetry reading at Bucknell, absolutely astonishing moment of your mother's, shall we say, entry into the world of some part of the world of modern poetry. These are families that have, what shall I call it? They have they have muscles and emotional responses of immense power. And I've taken this to be the case since now, the fifth or the sixth time I've read it. I'm even more impressed with the picture of your family life and how you breathe this vigor into them. And yet rape is the exact opposite of that. It's the tension between the two that I thought about when I was thinking of, these almost, what would you call it, hallucinatory moments when you had your childhood illness. Was it measles? I think it was measles.
Yes.
It could have been chickenpox. And your grandmother is basically engaging in a kind of chant, maybe like a shaman. She's there to bring the dead back, to make sure that her beloved grandson survives. It was something deeply profound in the way in which she did it. She called the spirits to protect you. And if anyone could protect you, it was she. She was quite extraordinary. It's that image of the strength of family life, which has, I think, to be celebrated in your book. I can say from many other instances, this is a subject still taboo among survivors of the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews. It's still taboo. It is not possible to explore without raising the issue of blaming the victim, all of the inevitable compromises that people use when they construct narratives that deal with rape. And I think this may, in fact, be an important part of the Armenian story, if I can be so bold as to say that your contribution to the historical consciousness of the genocide is the power of Armenian culture and family life to survive despite all. This is a theme in many other cases, but it is powerful. And I wonder whether you were conscious of the fact that you were writing a story about Armenian families in general, not just your Armenian family in particular.
Well, Jay, I'm grateful for your reflection deeply, and of course, it takes great critics like you to conceptualize what the writer isn't fully aware of. The writer, I'm making the story out of the materials that are given to me, and also the materials I'm inventing and crafting with language, and in the process of making scenes and characters and dialogue and deep images and so on. But I do want to address what you're saying. I appreciate it greatly. And I want to note that, there are two really rich places in Black Dog of Fate that deal with rape and violence to women. The one is the chapter Dovey's story, about the extraordinary story of my grandmother's dear friend, Aravni, which translates as Dovey in English, and what she endured, the cruelty, the abduction, her escape from a Kurdish household where she had, been abducted and raped or conscripted into being a man's wife for a short period of time. And then what happens to her, she does survive and she makes it to the US. And then the extraordinary volume of poems that my grandfather, the physician, Diron Balakian, was the source for, because he wrote a series of letters from the killing fields in Adana, Turkey in 1909, where 20 to 30,000 Armenians had been massacred. It really was a prologue to the genocide of 1915. And he had been called there to do relief work. And he wrote these letters back home to Istanbul. And his good friend, the poet Siamanto, whose given name was Adam Yarjanyan, Siamanto wrote a book of poems, Bloody News from My Friend, and perhaps the most famous poem, and I collaboratively translated that, and there's an English edition out that's been out for 25 years now or more. and I urge viewers to track that book down. It's still in print. The poem called "The Dance" is a poem of edgy graphic description, perhaps in the realm of what the trench poets in Britain would do in the next decade, a kind of bearing witness poem about Armenian women being beaten to death, whipped to death, as they are forced to circle dance and then being burnt alive. So those were moments in the story where I was, just compelled to pursue the horrors of genocidal mass killing in the domain of violence to women, in the profound engendered reality of genocide, in which women bear an enormous burden
Yes.
of being raped, abducted, and killed, or having sometimes women choose to commit suicide rather than endure what's waiting for them. So it is in the heart of that second part of my memoir.
Yes.
Those episodes.
May I now ask you? This is something Michel Toussaint was interested in too. Is Bishop Gregory's Balakian, your extraordinary, shall we say, dialogue with him, and the construction of his work, his life, his memoir, his memory. Could you tell me how you began this project and what shaped the approach you took to producing it?
The story of my great uncle. He's my grandfather's cousin and my grandmother's uncle, because my grandparents were cousins once removed, something not that uncommon for that era in certain cultures, I suppose. But anyway, that family tightness. So the bishop, he became a bishop in the Armenian church, an extraordinary man who wrote about 10 books. We have three of them survived, and 2 of them I had the good fortune of being a collaborative translator with, because I don't have the Armenian to do it from the original. I was able to work with a brilliant man, Aris Sevag, to translate his 2-volume Armenian Genocide Survivor Memoir. It's a really special book, a book that weighs a lot, and a book that everyone who reads it tells me how much they learn about the event, both conceptually, intellectually, as well as granularly and personally. Armenian Golgotha is the title. It's in print and paperback. He is another one of those discovered, repressed pieces of the past, and I discover him as I'm working on Black Dog of Fate, and I write about the discovery in one of the last chapters of the memoir. It was part of the story. He ended his life after his arduous survival in the killing fields. He was at the Paris Peace Treaty in 1919 at a small Armenian delegation that was hoping for a modicum of justice after the slaughter. He then went to Manchester, England, where he was the priest in the Armenian church there, and then he became the bishop of the Armenian Church of South France, and he ended his life in Marseille. And I have visited his church in Marseille more than once, and there's a beautiful statue monument to him there. But is this interesting thing for me about writing the memoir was the degree to which it was a journey of discovery and surprise. And discovery and surprise are good things for a writer working on this kind of a book. one of my friends sent me a clipping from a French magazine with a picture of my great uncle. And my friend Leo Hamalian, wonderful literary critic and scholar, wrote in the margin, any relation. And I knew it was, I knew who he was, but I didn't know anything about his past and the gravitas of his career. I just knew we had this clergyman uncle who died in France, because my father and my aunts, Anna and Nona, my father's sister on the Balakian side, didn't want to talk. They didn't, nothing was said about him. So a newspaper, a magazine clipping, a little bit of digging. Next thing you know, a big door to the past opens. And in fact, in that magazine clipping, I learned that he wrote this 2-volume memoir about his survivor experience. And boy, the hair on my head stood up. And then I asked another friend of mine who had just finished translating with me the Siamanto poems. I asked my friend Nivart Yalyan, who was at Cornell University. I said, Nivart, can you get me these books? I know they're in Armenian, but we will translate them. And 2 or 3 weeks later, from Beirut, arrived in my mailbox, 2-volume set. I spent the next 15 years working with others translating that. So anyway, these are the kinds of marvelous discovery journeys that helped me build a deeper understanding of this important historical event of mass killing known as the Armenian Genocide.
Mm-hmm. Well, one question that I thought of immediately in rereading it is, was there ever a moment where his belief in God was shaken by the events he's recounting himself? And this is a problem of theology more generally, and I've met a few very distinguished theologians who say it's embedded in every theologian's account. Doubt is like breathing. We have no alternative if we want to live. To breathe is to doubt. Would you extend that to the bishop?
I think the memoir, his memoir, Armenian Golgotha, gives palpable reality to the power of his faith and his commitment to his role as a pastor. He is driven, and I think probably this contributes to his survival. He's driven to keep performing his clerical pastoring role by leading the groups of bedraggled and, starving Armenian men, women, and children along the deportation trails as he finds them. And he finds himself, in that role of, you're going to make it. We have plans, we have strategy. He's talking to them. He's constantly in that role of pastoring. And he believes that out of this bloodbath, there will come an independent Armenian nation, which of course did happen in the Southwest Caucasus, where the Republic of Armenia is today. That's a much longer history we won't discuss here and now. But so his identity as a clergyman, his role as a pastor, and his faith are sustaining stories. They're sustaining themes in his memoir.
And of course, the church has played that role for centuries in Armenian history as an embodiment of the national dream, an embodiment of, if you will, of the national soul. I don't doubt it. It was a question of what I would call existential doubt that we can find even in people like Bonhoeffer, who went to his grave believing, or his execution believing, that it can be found in many Jewish writers too. Deep faith and yet doubt because of the inevitable contradiction between the events and the beliefs. it perhaps is inflected in different ways, but there are very interesting material that has come out of Africa, out of the interrogation of how various clergymen could have both participated in the genocide and resisted it in other ways. That's the reason I ask. What I wonder about, Peter, is whether you would do us the honor of reading a number of your own poems. We've talked about prose extensively. The poetry that you have offered, not only with the entirely, I would have almost said, inevitable Pulitzer Prize attached to it, given the beauty and the force of your writing, but the poetry is in many respects a very powerful, I would say, extension of American writing. When I hear you, when I read you, I hear Walt Whitman, I hear Emily Dickinson, and that is said with great, humility. These are the greats. But at the same time, am I right in saying that these American origins are, as it were, the constituent elements of the music of your poetry?
Absolutely. Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson are, for me, as for many American poets, mother and father.
Yeah.
That's just fact, because they invented new forms, period. They invented new forms, and they were American-based forms. So yes, I'm an American poet for whom the Armenian past has had a pull. It's not the only thing that percolates in my poems. Like any poet, love, war, art, God, sex, nature, cooking, everything, fishing. The experiences of being alive are what your poems kind of inhabit over the course of decades of writing. But the Armenian cultural resonance and the genocide past, they certainly have played a role in my work. I thought I'd read maybe 3 poems, Jay.
Yes, please.
I thought but I appreciate your sense of my my American sensibility, and the American poetry landscape is a large, vast, and interesting one. I want to read a couple poems from my recent book, No Sign. And I have a group of poems in this book that are meditations on fruits and vegetables. And they evolve into meditations on other things. They take me other places: family, cooking, history. In this poem, given the context of the Armenian Genocide and my grandmother that we've discussed here, I think reading this poem will fit in. It's called Eggplant. I love the white moon circles and the purple halos on a plate as the salt sweat them. The oil in the pan smoked like bad days in the Syrian desert, when a moon stayed all day, when morning was a purple elegy for the last friend seen, when the fog of the riverbank rose like a holy ghost. My mother made those white moons sizzle in some egg wash and salt. Some parsley appeared from the garden, and summer evenings came with no memory, but the table with white dishes. Shining aubergine, black-skinned beauty, bitter apple. We used our hands. It's a strange experience to, strange is an understatement, certainly singular for me, to have finally gone to Turkey after years of thinking and writing about my Armenian past, my family's past in Turkey. My father's family were prosperous coal merchants in Constantinople, which became Istanbul around 1922 with the founding of the modern Turkish Republic. And I finally, through many complicated circumstances, found my way to Istanbul. And I ended up going a few times in a safe period between 2013 and 2015. So in this poem, I'm taking on the idea of coming to the city of your family's past, where they've all been exiled, killed, or silenced. And I have one surviving cousin there today. Coming to Istanbul. Follow the gaze of Athena down a cistern where water glows. Follow silver snakes along Marmara and Golden Horn. Walk over the black plaque for Hrant Dink, smack in the street in Shishli. Follow the ferry waves to Uskadar, where your father was born, where your uncle returned incognito from prison. Drink the split bourbon voice of Ray Charles in the cafe in Taksim, under the red flags of star and moon, guns to the head, wild prayer, streets banging with pots and pans, rage at the dictator. Walk by in oblivion and terror. An American, an Armenian, black shirt, under the olive trellised restaurant, hotel, rooftop, light rinsed Bosphorus, hot rocky fumes in the throat, under the wind umbrellas and boutique glass facades of Beyoğlu, galleries of blue mosaics, magenta carpets. The Ottoman historian pours you tan and wine into the sunset. Follow the lights on the bridge into the chandelier of the sky. Trompe l'oeil of gray wolves, voices of Turkish friends in the stone. Follow ghost signs, midnight cab, smashed cafe windows, night sea journey of beloveds, Byzantine dirt smoke roads past Tobacco Reggie and Sultana crates. Haidar Pasha of Armenian soul death hour. Lost family, come greet me in your city.
Well, that's really quite extraordinary. That phrase, in your city, the end of the poem, in your city, the city of the dead. I wonder about the difficulty that you faced when you were walking through Istanbul. It's the difficulty I faced in walking through Warsaw, where my family came from and were exterminated. And I think there's a parallel because when Warsaw was reconstructed in 1946, they put the streets of the Jewish ghetto in other places because there weren't any people around to live there. So it didn't really matter whether Krosmalna Street was here or there or anywhere else. It is your city to my grandfather's 17 brothers and sisters who were murdered. And I felt deeply uncomfortable, without your poetic gift. I don't think I could express it, but to what extent did you feel that undercurrent of loss as overwhelming when you were there? I can tell you that that's exactly what I felt in Warsaw. Did you feel it in Istanbul?
Yeah, Jay, you've certainly zeroed in on some really fundamental psychological and emotional conditions that you and I have both experienced in our different cities of family location and home. And I would add that, and we haven't had a chance to talk about this today, but that the persistent state policy of Turkish government denial of the Armenian genocide, of the rewriting of the history, of the falsifying of the history, of the efforts to suppress and silence the expressions about the facts and truth of this history in other countries, Turkey going to other societies to try to do this, this game is pretty much over for the Turkish state, but not inside Turkey. So going to Turkey as an Armenian writer, one is always aware of the fact that you are in some way, just being who you are, taboo. I'm taboo when I go to Turkey, and I know that, and I know I'm being watched. However, there's the present of the tabooism, and then there's the past of the ghosts, as you're noting, which haunt you everywhere. And you know, that's a heavy thing that keeps playing out in your mind and in your feelings as you walk through the city. There are about 30,000 Armenians left in Istanbul today. So there are still Armenian streets. There are a couple of Armenian schools and churches. So there's that's even complexly evocative and provocative, because you know, these are real ties to the bloody period of the 1890s to the 1920s, and ties even further back to an Armenian civilization that was once very vital. So yeah, it's a heavy load to carry when you are walking back those streets.
One thing, Peter, may be different in our two reactions. I'll put it to you to see whether you have any thoughts on it. That obliteration, entire annihilation of a world, which is the fate of both peoples, made me wonder whether there is such a thing as my city. The whole idea of proprietary belonging to a place, I've always had difficulty in accepting, and it may explain why I'm in the French countryside now. But I feel in some ways the New York Yankees cap that your grandmother had, she's transferred it to you. It's one of her gifts to you, that you have more of a sense of home than I do. Now, that may be entirely personal, but I do believe that we are part of a larger story of displacement and of dislocation. And I once again want to say that the power of your language is to anchor being in the music of your words. It may be that which is an anchoring device. Unfortunately, I don't have that. So I find the memory of the destruction of the world more productive of a wandering mind,
Right.
than of an American mind. I was born 5 years before you in the same place at the same time, with the same baby boom generation and marvelous economic opportunities opening up for people like us who came from different parts of the world. And there you are on the rock-bound coast of Maine, and with a great deal of affection for your childhood, something I never had. And I suppose what I'm asking you for a time when we can meet over a drink is, how did you do it? How did you stabilize your sense of self in a place where others like me never was able to do it?
Well, you know, Jay, your reflection resonates with me as well, and it's going to lead me to read my final poem if we have time, which is
Yes, we do.
which is a poem about diaspora. As for the bigger question about childhood and orientations, well, we'll save it for a bottle of wine. We'll do that,
Yes.
and I'll talk to you more about that. We'll make that happen sooner than later. Okay.
Good. I
But
appreciate
I
it.
would like to close with a poem from my 2015 book, Ozone Journal, that deals with diaspora and family and the aftermath of catastrophe. I'm sorry, I need maybe, let me, and I would note that I have family on almost every continent, and we have had family at different times in Northern Africa and in South Asia, in Calcutta, and now we're still all over the world, and that's because of the event, the great explosion for the Jews of Europe in the 1940s, for the Armenians of Anatolia in the 19-teens, and for other populations and ethnic groups all over the planet. This is tragically a part of what's happened. And this poem is called Home. All right, I'm going to take one break and get
Yes,
more
please do.
so I can
Please.
read this really well. Let me just do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Michelle, if I can ask you after Peter completes his poem, if you'd like to offer a comment, thought, question, whatever you'd like, I'd be very grateful for you to do that.
I'd be happy to.
Hearing poetry read by a poet is really something special.
Okay, I'm back with my pipes, I hope, working here. This is called Home. Driving Route 20 to Syracuse, past pastures of cows and falling silos. You feel the desert stillness near the refineries at the Syrian border. Walking in fog on Maycock's Bay, the long lines of squawking birds on shore. You're walking along Flinders Street Station, the flaring yellow stone and walls of windows where your uncle landed after he fled a Turkish prison. You walked all day along the Yara, crossing the sculptural bridges with their twisting steel, the hollow sound of the didgeridoo like the flutes of Anatolia. One road is paved with coins, another with razor blades and ripped condoms. Walking the boardwalk in January past Atlantic City Hall, the rusted deco ticket sign, the waves black into white, you smell the grilled cevapi in the Bashagia of Sarajevo. And that street took you to the Jewish cemetery where the weeds grew over the slabs and a mausoleum stood intact. There was a trail of cornelian you followed in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, and picking up those stones now, you're walking in the salt marsh on the potato fields, the day undercut by the flatness of the sky, the wide view of the Atlantic, the cold spray. Your uncle stashed silk and linen, lace and silver in a suitcase on a ship that docked not far from here. The ship moved in and out of port for years, and your uncle kept coming and going from Melbourne to London to Kolkata and back, never returning to the Armenian village near the Black Sea. The topaz ring you passed on in a silver shop in Aleppo appeared on Lexington off 65th. The shop owner, a young guy from Ivory Coast, shrugged when you told him you had seen it before. The shuffled dust of that street fills your throat, and you remember how a slew of coins poured out of your pocket like a slinky near the ruined castle, now a disco in Thessaloniki, where a young girl was stabbed under the strobe lights. Lights that lit the sky that was the iridescent eye of a peacock in Larnaca at noon. When you walked into the church where Lazarus had come home to die, and you forgot that Lazarus died because the story was in one of your uncle's books that were wrapped in newspaper in a suitcase and stashed under the seat of an old Ford. And when he got to the border, he left the car and walked the rest of the way. And when you passed the apartment on 116th and Broadway, where your father grew up, though it's a dorm now, that suitcase is buried in a closet under clothes. And when you walk past the security guard at the big glass entrance door, you're walking through wet grass, clouds clumped on a hillside, a subway station sliding into water.
Thank you very much, Peter. Michelle, may I ask if you would want to offer a thought or two?
Well, thank you. This is wonderful. And Peter, your work has meant a lot to me over the years. In fact, the inspiration for the last book I wrote was that quote that in Armenian Golgotha that he says about the war not being over. Our nightmare is not over in 1918. That some people's nightmare continues well into 1923. And that kind of inspired me to think about that 5-year period. And so I want to thank you for your work. I've taught Black Dog of Fate, and I was recently doing mapping of these journeys and these routes. I gave a talk at the University of Michigan where we did ArcGIS imaging of figuring out where all the Armenian Genocide survivors went. I used 50 memoirs, and I used Armenian Golgotha as one of my first ones to chart how people move and how people survive. And I charted the women, and I charted the single men, and I charted the families, and to put those intersections. Anyway, that book was really important because it gave me so much texture in the memoir. So I also had an Aunt Gladys and an Armenian grandmother. I wonder what she would think of me doing the work I do now in Las Vegas. Those are her kilims. I don't know if you can see them in the back hanging on our on our walls.
Fabulous.
But it's it's very moving to hear you describe this. We are California, not East, but your work has meant a lot, and it kind of I started doing feminist journalism at Berkeley. That was my first book and my dissertation. And I don't think in 1999 I could have written anything about the Armenian Genocide and been taken seriously as a scholar in history. But Jay, your work too, and your work has allowed me to sort of move towards these questions about politics in the East. So I guess it's more of a sort of a fan comment than it's a substantive one. But it really did mean a lot to hear you speak. And congratulations on the big prize, and the poetry is wonderful. So please, thank you for what you've done.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm glad to meet you and to know about your work, and I look forward to it. And I'm really it's great to hear, gratifying to hear that Armenian Golgotha, was such good octane for your work. And thank you. And we'll I hope have more conversation.
Sure. Thank you very much. This was lovely today. I really appreciate
being here. We've got the West Coast to France to Calcutta here on this. This is as global a Zoom as you can get.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. Thank you.
That is certainly the case. Well, I think that it may be just useful to have one or two more questions, and then perhaps call it an evening. Or a morning, depending where you are. One of the things that I wonder about, though, is the extent to which the story of the Armenian genocide is still open, is still to be told. I think in some respects, what you were pointing to, Michelle, it is so vast a story. It has so much variety in strategies of survival. The same perhaps would be true in terms of the literature of the Armenian diaspora. I wonder if you'd like to to talk, Peter, about other Armenian writers who have influenced you. Gorky, there are many others that come to mind, but it seems to me that there can be much more, and I certainly would like to know more and to have our fellow listeners to explore the field of Armenian poetry and of Armenian writing. Is there something you would recommend if you had to speak to the uninitiate like me? Where would you start if you wanted to bring some degree of appreciation of the richness of Armenian poetry and prose to the current generation?
Jay, one thing that's happened in the last 30 years is a good benchmark. It's just been an incredible opening up of new terrain. There are so many interesting and talented Armenian diasporan writers, poets, fiction writers, nonfiction writers, filmmakers, visual artists. And there must be a good there should be a good bibliography. I know I had a partial bibliography of the arts at the end of, I'm not wondering if it's the end of, I think at the end of maybe my book, The Burning Tigress. But it's evolving by the year. There are too many titles and names to mark one or two, but I would say that the impact of some powerful Armenian sensibilities on me, for example, the painting of Arshil Gorky, some of the early fiction of William Saroyan. Saroyan was a kind of monument of Armenian imagination and sensibility for decades. Diana Derhovanesyan has a marvelous anthology of Armenian poetry. I hope it's still in print. It's called Armenian Poetry from, classical origins to the present. And the present was probably the 1970s at that point, so that's a bit dated. And it's probably a propitious time to have an anthology of Armenian diasporan writing. I will say there was an issue of a very fine journal called Poetry International that came out, I think it was last fall, that featured Armenian poets, and there are a lot of good poets in there. So it's been an opening up. It's been a real pouring out, as if for a long time the Armenian discourse had been backed up or dammed up, and then history percolates the ingredients that it does, and intellectual work, and the intellectual work has been incredible too, the scholarly work. I mean, this well, in the 1970s probably into the 70s and 80s, you could count the interesting sources on the Armenian genocide in English, at least, on your two hands, maybe one hand, I don't know, but by 2010, there were just dozens and dozens of important works. This history found its time for exploration, expression.
Well, Peter, maybe we could end on this note, because it seems I want to put at least to you the possibility that the full flowering of what I would call the Armenian narrative needed your mixture of poetry and prose to give it form. It had volume, it had distinction and scholarship of the highest order, but there's something that poetry adds, which is, and I hate the word music because it's too neutral. There's something that I would say is elevating about a literature which can be proud of its own poetry. And I don't think that that we scholars are at the core. I don't know whether you would agree, Michelle. I don't think history drives memory. I think memory drives history more than the other way around. And poetry is the music of memory. I don't know if you would even accept the distinction, Michelle, but it's one that I've been struggling with for many years. The overlap between the two is obvious. But at the same time, think about the way the history of the Nazi Holocaust worked. It was entirely railway timetables for 20 years. It required other things, and Israeli poetry, alongside diaspora poetry, provided some very extraordinary moments. Think, if you will, not Israeli, think of Paul Celan. Without Paul Celan, would there be a consciousness of the Holocaust? I'm more, shall we say, a patriot of poetry than I am of history. Do you have any thoughts on that? How much difference poetry makes in the construction of historical consciousness? Michelle, do you want to add a phrase?
I just reviewed Harry Hartunian's work piece, which seems to, it doesn't use poetry, but it's really interesting the way he uses memory and experience in this way to sort of extract a sense of his world and his life as an academic. And I do think that the historians have something to add. You spend so many years saying this happened, this happened, this happened. You can't actually do the experience. You can't get over the hump of saying the experiential part of it, because so much of it was about the combating the denial. And
Yes.
you can do that through poetry, you can do that through prose, but the historical, like you said, the timetables, like you need to do that work. And so much of that work was done in the way. When I wrote my first piece on this, I actually said in the first bit, it's like, I don't want to fight with you if this happened or not. You decide that. Like, I'm going to just tell you the story from the perception of the archives that I've seen. And I'm going, and to boldly say that in 2005, 2010, you couldn't have done that 10 years earlier. So I think in this way that allowing the voice of the experience to come through requires this getting over this sense of this really didn't happen to you. And, your grandmother might have had some wrong memories there. There might have been, maybe this was just politics and someone's making all this up. That, I think, is a big hump to being able to talk about experience.
Yeah.
And I think that those two things have to work together in that way. So I don't know. I think poetry and experience have to come from a place where you've accepted the event as real, and people around you aren't saying this didn't happen.
Maybe I agree with you entirely, Michelle. The only qualification I would make is that all too frequently, I know that it happened, but I still can't believe it. There's something about experience which is surreal, beyond my notion of reality. And it's at that moment that I go to Paul Celan and other poets, because they're the people who tell me what reality is, not the archive. The archive tells me something else. But there's room for many different ways of configuring it. What I am sure about is that the landscape of the memory of the Armenian Genocide and the history of the Armenian Genocide was changed by your writing, Peter. I can say that without the slightest doubt. And that is something of which anyone would be proud. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, I'm grateful to you for your affirmation of poetry. Believe me, poets don't always feel at the center of intellectual life or discourse, especially as the digital age has evolved as it has. So I do believe that, the role of the poet is an ancient one in communities, societies, and nations, as old as communities and societies and nations have been historically. Bards have had their way into the psyche of a community through the pulsations and the rhythms and the chants of lyric language. So I'm only saying that in gratitude to your affirmation as a public intellectual and historian. Your affirmation of poetry is a wonderful thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sumava, for organizing this meeting. And I would imagine that your students in Calcutta are entirely sensitive to the issue of the significance of poetry in not only world affairs, but in our own lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you
And
all.
I can
Thank
say
you,
that
Jay.
we can congratulate, I think, ourselves on making room for the necessary, the poetic dimension of historical narrative. All the best. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.